My name is Jeff Hunt. I'm the director of the Texas Military Forces Museum. We're in the museum's Great Hall in front of some of its most significant World War I artifacts to talk about the role of the Texas National Guard in the First World War. And this, of course, is a very appropriate thing because April 6th of 2017 marked the 100th anniversary of America's entry into the First World War. World War I is one of the most important conflicts in human history. It's the second bloodiest war that humanity has ever fought. It's only World War II inflicted more casualties and more devastation on the nations of the world. But World War I is often a conflict that is overshadowed by its larger and bloodier cousin in the 1940s. And it's also a war that a lot of Americans don't really understand. They don't know where the war came from. They don't really know why the United States fought in that war, and they don't understand the consequences of World War I. So we'll start off by trying to explain where the First World War came from. Warfare between the nation states of Europe has been a continual thing, really from state all the way until 1815. 1815 saw the Battle of Waterloo and the downfall of Napoleon's France. And in the aftermath of that particular conflict, the Napoleonic Wars, which had lasted for almost 23 years, the great powers of Europe sat down around the peace conference and made a peace that would last more or less for almost half a century. Unfortunately, the conflict that ended with the downfall of Napoleon would be superseded by a much more bloody struggle, which would become World War I. And the origins of World War I are complex and they're multifaceted. But central to the coming of the war was the desire of the King of Prussia, Kaiser Wilhelm I, to unite all the German-speaking peoples of Central Europe under a single throne, into a single empire. Germany, at that point in history, was not a country in the way that we understand it to be a country today. Germany was a geographic region, so people said Germany the way we say New England or the Southwest. Before the Napoleonic Wars, Germany was 300 different principalities, city-states, with Prussia being the only one of real significance. After the Napoleonic Wars, Germany was reduced to 30 provinces, with Prussia still the primary one. The Prussians controlled a good portion of those Germanic provinces, but a number of them were also controlled by Austria, and Alsace and Lorraine were controlled by the French. Kaiser Wilhelm I and his mastermind diplomat and Chancellor Otto von Bismarck orchestrated a series of wars that enabled the Prussians to pull all of these Germanic-speaking provinces together. And the first of these was the Austro-Prussian War, which was fought in the summer of 1866. It was a very brief conflict. The Prussians easily won it. And as a result of that, several of the Germanic provinces that were controlled by the Austrian Empire were handed over to Prussia. Several other Germanic provinces that had sort of had pseudo-independence and walked a fine line between the Prussians and the Austrians decided to come over and join the Prussian Empire. And in the aftermath of this military and diplomatic coup, Bismarck, who was as talented a diplomat as Europe ever produced, managed to make up with the Austrians. The Austrians and the Germans became friends with each other as a result. And so the big step toward creating a German Reich, or a single German kingdom, had been taken, and that left the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, which were controlled by the French and are on the west bank of the Rhine River. The French, unlike the Austrians, have very little common ground with the Germans. The Austrians and the Germans speak the same language. They have the same culture. The French and the Germans are very, very different. So when the war came between France and Prussia over Alsace and Lorraine, it was a longer war. It was fought from 1870 to 1871. It was a much more bloody war, a much more vicious war. And although the Prussians won it, and they won it relatively easily, it left the French very deeply embittered. And from the moment the Franco-Prussian War, as it was called, ends, everybody knows that there's going to be a rematch between Germany and Austria, between Germany and France. The French will want to redeem their humiliating defeat. They're going to want to get Alsace and Lorraine back. And so in the aftermath of that conflict, the great powers of Central Europe, the French and the Germans, fell into an arms race with one another. And this was something that was going to happen with every country in Europe. It was going to drag all of them into it. The Industrial Revolution made it possible for the first time in history to keep mass armies in the field, armies that numbered in the millions of men. It became possible to feed them and clothe them and equip them and to train them. And it became possible for trained soldiers who had served their active duty to go into the reserves, ready to be called up in the event of emergency, because the railroads would allow them to rapidly mobilize, to assemble at their armories, get their equipment, go to their assembly areas. And this meant that the nations of Europe were arming themselves to the teeth with new weapons and unprecedented levels of militarization in the hope of avoiding the outbreak of war. These were all really defensive measures. The problem is that one of the lessons that all military men and most diplomats drew from the Austro-Prussian and the Franco-Prussian War was that the country that mobilized first ultimately won a conflict because they could mass on their enemy's border. They would invade the enemy's country. The war would be fought on the enemy's territory, and ultimately the invader would prevail. And so that meant that what everybody was trying to do in a defensive measure was actually looked upon by potential rivals as a grave offensive threat, because an army massed on your frontier to defend your borders could be an army that, with just the word of command, launches an invasion into your territory. And thus, you had a situation to where the French and the Germans were staring at each other, armed to the teeth, expecting the next war. And in addition to that, you had a situation where the new king of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, desired to ensure that Germany was considered a great power. And to be a great power, you had to have an empire. And so the Germans got into what was called the Great Game, along with the British and the French and the Belgians and the Russians, and the Japanese, and even to some extent the Americans, going around the world, gathering up colonies that could provide natural resources and marketplaces that would ensure that your nation would be powerful, your nation would be rich, and your nation would be secure. Overseas trade, of course, was vulnerable to interdiction by enemy navies, and Britain at this point in history had the greatest navy on the face of the planet. Britain's naval supremacy was so great that in fact it couldn't realistically be challenged by anybody. Interestingly, the British became the destructive force of their own naval supremacy when they invented a new type of warship, and that was the dreadnought. They actually built the first modern battleship, the all-steel warship powered by oil, not coal, and with its firepower concentrated in just a handful of revolving gun turrets, mounting weapons that could fire 10, 15, 20 miles. And when that first British battleship, the HMS Dreadnought, went to sea, suddenly all the warships of every other nation on the planet were obsolete. And this meant that the Germans, who were trying to build this great overseas empire, had a chance to now match Britain's naval power. And so the Germans began to build dreadnoughts, as well as the British, and then the French and the Italians, the Americans and the Japanese. Everybody begins to build dreadnoughts. And so we had a naval arms race to the arms race that's going on the continent of Europe. And all of this increases tensions. And in the midst of these tensions, the countries of Europe begin to make alliances with each other. So the French know that they're going to someday fight the Germans. The French therefore go and make an alliance with the Russians, who are, of course, on the eastern flank of Germany. So that if France and Germany go to war, Russia is obligated to come into the war on the side of the French and force the Germans to fight on two fronts. The Germans responded to that by making an alliance with the newly created Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had been cobbled together in 1867 by combining the Austrian and Hungarian empires in a hope that they could kind of keep a lid on the Balkans. And that part of Europe had always been problematic. It was where many great civilizations and empires had washed ashore and brushed against each other throughout history. And it was also an area where the Russians in particular had a great deal of interest, because one of the things Russia wanted was access to the world's oceans at all seasons of the year. And the difficulty for the Russians was that their fleet would be iced in Murmansk during the winter months, and their other fleet in the Black Sea had to pass through the narrow straits of the Dardanelles between Turkey and the mainland of Europe, and those straits could easily be blocked. So the Russians always dreamed of obtaining a warm water port on the Adriatic. And of course, the Adriatic brushes against the shoreline of the Balkans, and so the Russians have an interest in this region. The British and the French have an interest in that region. The Austrians and the Hungarians had an interest in the region. So the Balkans had always been a volatile point, a powder keg in European history, and the hope was that the Austro-Hungarian Empire could sort of put a lid on that and contain it. Unfortunately, that's not going to work out, because the Austro-Hungarian Empire was expansive, and it gobbled up a part of the Balkans known as Bosnia-Herzegovina. And the difficulty with the Austro-Hungarian annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina was that this was land that was coveted by Serbia. The Serbs were a very nationalist people who felt that Bosnia-Herzegovina was theirs. The Serbs also were culturally and linguistically and religiously much more like the Russians than they were the Austrians or the French. And the Serbs therefore agitated to undo the annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina by the Austro-Hungarians. And ultimately that led to the event that's going to be the spark that's going to ignite World War I, and that was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne, by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, in July of 1914. The evidence is pretty strong that these Serbian nationalists, today we would probably call them terrorists, had been trained and were being paid and encouraged by at least elements of the Serbian government. And so with the assassination of the Archduke, the Austro-Hungarians saw an opportunity to finally deal with Serbia once and for all. And in this regard, they were encouraged to take strong action by the Germans. And so the Austro-Hungarians sent an ultimatum to the Serbs that would basically require them to all but surrender their independence as punishment for the assassination of the Archduke. The Serbs actually bent over pretty far to try and meet those demands, but at the end of the day, they were unwilling to take every step the Austro-Hungarians demanded. So the Austro-Hungarians declared war on Serbia. And this triggered this web of entangling alliances that had descended upon Europe since the Franco-Prussian War. And so the Russians and the Germans go to war with each other, which means the Germans and the French go to war with each other, and the Austro-Hungarians go to war with both the Russians and the French. And ultimately, the dominoes will continue to fall until virtually every country in Europe is engaged in this war. And since most of these countries were the world's great empires, the British and the French in particular, that meant that their colonies go to war as well. The Germans had long expected having to fight a two-front war between the Russians in the east and the French in the west. And they had developed a very elaborate plan for how to deal with that. And the plan was to trade space for time in the east, because they believed Russia would mobilize very slowly and they could give ground in face of a Russian advance, while the Germans concentrated the bulk of their forces for a quick knockout blow against the French. And the idea was for a German army of invasion to sweep through neutral Belgium, capturing the Channel ports as they swung to the north of Paris and then came around behind Paris to encircle and capture it. This was a pretty good plan, and it would have probably worked, except that Russia mobilized faster than the Germans expected. And as a consequence of that, the Germans had to shift more troops to the east than they had planned, which weakened their offensive to the west, so that they didn't come in and around behind Paris. They approached Paris from the northeast. And another consequence of the German plan was that by invading neutral Belgium, they brought England into the war, because the Germans, for some reason, had assumed that the Belgians would simply let their armies march through their territory. They didn't. The Belgians saw this as an invasion and they fought back. So it upset the German timetables. And since England had guaranteed Belgium's neutrality, when the Germans invaded Belgium, England comes into the war on the side of the Belgians, the French, and the British. So now you have England, and that means Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa in the war as well. The German offensive in 1914 came very, very close to capturing Paris and defeating the Allies, but almost at the last moment, the British and the French won a major victory along the Marne River to the northeast of Paris. And at that point, both sides found themselves completely exhausted. Neither one of them really had any offensive capacity left for the time being. And so the Germans retreated until they got to defensible terrain in France, and then they turned around to face their pursuers and began to dig in. The British and the French pursued, came up against the German defenses, didn't have the strength to push through them, and so they had to stop and dig in as well. And now you got something that nobody had anticipated: the development of trench warfare. The trench systems would grow with remarkable speed and with increasing complexity, and they would ultimately stretch all the way from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Now, trench warfare is as old as history itself. You can look in the Old Testament of the Bible and find all kinds of references to it. But trench or siege warfare had always been focused on a particular geographic point, an attempt to capture a city, or something, or to hold a relatively small geographic area. Now you had a trench front line that stretched for 500 miles. And this was something new in warfare. Everyone had expected that the next war that happened in Europe would be like the Franco-Prussian or the Austro-Prussian War. It would be a conventional war of maneuver. There would be a handful of big battles. They would be very bloody, but they would be decisive. And then the losing party would sue for peace, and everybody would sit down around the conference table and restore the balance of power in Europe. And it would be over in a year and a half at most. Now you have a stalemate. There is no more maneuver. There are no ways to outflank your enemy. And that means that frontal attack is the only option left. And frontal attack in the era of the Industrial Revolution was an incredibly bloody and dangerous thing. These trench systems were, as I said, very deep and very complex. It wasn't a single trench. It was a whole series of trenches, supply dumps, artillery positions. And in front of these trenches, you would have a zone of death. Primarily because of the introduction into warfare of the machine gun. These weren't the first machine guns to be invented. The first of those show up during the American Civil War, but by the time you get to 1914, the machine gun, like this German MG-08, had been perfected. It can fire 600 rounds a minute for a sustained period of time. And now the three-man crew of a machine gun had the firepower that it used to take 1,000 men to mass on the battlefield. So inside these very complex trench systems, you had machine guns, and in front of them you had very deep entanglements of barbed wire. Barbed wire, of course, invented in the United States in the 1870s, was going to change the nature of combat on the Western Front because now troops could not simply make a straightforward charge against their enemy. They would have to get through these entanglements of barbed wire. And the wire was usually 3 or 4 strands tall, and it could be dozens and dozens, sometimes hundreds of yards deep, so that as troops tried to advance from their trench toward the enemy trench, they were slowed down by the barbed wire, and they were subject to the fire of those machine guns, and in addition to the machine guns, the infantry in the trenches who were armed with repeating bolt-action rifles. They were also subject to the real killer on the Western Front, and that was massed artillery, like the 3-inch gun that you see here. This was a relatively small gun by World War I standards, but it could be incredibly deadly. There were thousands and thousands of these steel-tubed artillery pieces. Some of them could fire 5, 10, 15 miles. They could lob high explosive shell and shrapnel, as well as poison gas shells. And so once the attacking infantry got bogged down in no man's land, it was subject to the fire of the rifles, the machine guns, and then the artillery. And there was no way that you were going to make a successful attack through that kind of enemy firepower. So you had to come up with new ways to try and breach an enemy's front line. And the answer here again was the artillery. You would mass millions of men behind a certain sector of the front. You would assemble enormous quantities of supplies. And then you would spend days and sometimes weeks pummeling the enemy sector that you intended to attack with artillery fire. And the idea was the artillery fire would obliterate the barbed wire, would obliterate the enemy's trenches, knock out his machine guns, and make it possible for your infantry, when it went over the top, that is, to climb out of its trenches and advance through no man's land, to get to and breach the enemy's front line. Unfortunately, the artillery, no matter how massive the bombardment, never managed to knock down the barbed wire. It never managed to obliterate the enemy's trenches or knock out most of his machine guns or even kill most of his troops. What it did do was to create a moonscape in between the frontline trenches, that area that nobody controlled and therefore earned the rather appropriate name no man's land. That area was now nothing but one shell hole piled on another shell hole, no grass, no trees, no buildings. That meant that even a little bit of rain turned that area into a bottomless quagmire of mud. It was an area across which an offensive would have a very difficult time advancing. And even if that offensive was able to capture the enemy trench and begin to put a bulge in the defender's line, bringing supplies and reinforcements across this devastated moonscape was all but impossible. And so what was intended to be a way to breach the enemy's position actually backfired and became an inhibiting factor toward offensive operations. This was a stalemate that the generals hadn't anticipated, and of course it's a stalemate that they didn't like. And although World War I generals basically have a bad reputation in history as sort of being unimaginative and blundering, they were actually quite innovative, and they tried all kinds of ways to break open this trench stalemate. And so the airplane, which had first flown in 1903, rapidly becomes a weapon of war. First as an observation craft, but then as a fighter to shoot down observation planes and observation balloons, and then as a bomber to attack the enemy's front lines and his rear areas. The airplane added drama to the war, and it certainly made the war more deadly, but obviously it does nothing to break up the stalemate. And so the flamethrower was invented as a way to clear the trenches. And once again, we make the war bloodier and we make the war more horrible, but this isn't the magic bullet either. The next weapon that was tried was poison gas. So the Germans used it first, but the Allies quickly retaliated. Mustard gas, which was designed to burn the skin. Phosgene gas, which was designed to burn out the lungs. Chlorine gas, which would both blind, blister, and affect the lungs of a target. The gas was incredibly vicious on its targets, but very quickly, almost in the blink of an eye, both sides developed effective gas masks. They learned how to deal with gas, which tended to wound rather than kill. And one of the bad things about gas is it's a persistent agent. So if you shell the enemy's position with gas and then try to attack into that position, if you capture the ground, you have to deal with all this lingering gas. So once again, what was something everybody believed could break the stalemate actually enhances the stalemate. It makes offensive warfare that much harder to undertake. And so the consequence of all of this is that no matter what's tried, no matter how big the offensive both sides attempt, you get continued stalemate. And that stalemate, which remember stretches for 500 miles of front, is going to produce incredible casualties. In the first 2 years of the war, just the French, the Germans, and the British, and these are just three of the combatants, suffer almost 6 million casualties. and hardly move the trench lines a few miles in either direction. And so this is an unprecedented war. It's an unprecedented bloodbath, and there seems to be no end in sight. And for the United States, this is going to have consequences. American industry very quickly became involved in the war because industrial war happens on an industrial scale and consumes not only enormous numbers of human beings, it consumes enormous amounts of raw material, foodstuffs, and manufactured goods. And very quickly, the British in particular, but to some extent also the French, began to place orders in American factories for uniforms, for helmets, for munitions, for weapons, and American industry was happy to meet those needs. There was a lot of money to be made in selling munitions and other things to the warring powers. The British were, of course, very involved in transatlantic trade. And so they understood the importance of sea power. And one of the first things that the British did in World War I was to establish a naval blockade of Germany, to cut Germany off from the rest of the world, essentially to weaken the German economy. The Germans could not break the British naval blockade, but they could go under it with another new weapon of warfare, and that weapon was the submarine, which the internal combustion engine had made a viable instrument of war for the first time. So the German submarines, called Unterseeboats, or U-boats for short, could go underneath the British blockade and counter with a blockade of England and Ireland. So if the British were going to use their navy to cut Germany off from the trade of the world, then the Germans were going to use their submarines to cut England and Ireland off from trade with the rest of the world. The problem with U-boat warfare was that although what it's doing is as old as naval history itself, commerce raiding, attacking the enemy's overseas supply lines, it was doing it in a new way. The world had been using commerce raiding for hundreds and hundreds of years, and law and treaty and tradition had built up around commerce raiding, so that in the era of sailing ships, a commerce raider could safely stop a suspected enemy ship on the high seas, would have the time to board it, inspect it, see what it was carrying, examine its papers, and if it was determined that this was an enemy ship carrying the contraband of war, it could either remove the passenger and crew of the enemy ship onto the commerce raider and then sink the enemy ship, or force the enemy ship to sail with it to a friendly port where it would be confiscated and cargo and goods auctioned, but passenger and crew released in safety. By the time of World War I, you have airplanes, you have radio, and therefore any attempt by U-boat to stop a merchant ship was probably going to elicit a response from enemy warships or enemy aircraft. U-boats were very small, they were not armored, they were very slow. They would have a difficult time stopping a merchant ship in most instances because merchant ships were faster, but should they surface and spend hours trying to figure out what to do with a captured merchant ship, they would probably be attacked and sunk by an Allied surface ship. And therefore, of necessity, U-boats had to strike without warning, using their deck guns or their torpedoes, and that meant that, technically speaking, they were violating the laws of war that existed at the time. And this was a very serious problem for the United States because so much of England's trade was with America, and there were Americans going back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, and often they were sailing on British ships, and that meant that they were sailing into a war zone. They were sailing on ships that were subject to attack by German U-boats. And the Germans were very upfront about this. They published notices in American coastal newspapers saying, if you're getting on a ship that's flying a British or Allied flag and you're sailing to England or the continent of Europe, you're sailing into a war zone. And the ship you're on is subject to destruction without warning in that war zone. This was the potential fail point for America's determination to stay out of World War I. When the war broke out, President Woodrow Wilson declared that the United States was neutral. But having declared the United States was neutral, that we were not going to fight, he also said the United States is going to treat both sides equally. We'll loan money to both sides, we'll sell our raw materials and our foodstuffs and our manufactured goods to both sides. But having said that we were going to treat them equally, he did nothing to ensure that that happened. And since it was far easier for America to trade with England and France, who were traditional trading partners, America's industrial and agricultural capacity, America's financial capacity tilted very strongly toward the Allied side to the detriment of the Germans. This obviously doesn't make the Germans very happy, but they're careful to leave American ships alone. But what about Americans selling on British ships? And President Wilson's Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, warned the president that if he did not issue an executive order warning Americans against sailing on Allied ships into the war zone, sooner or later there would be an incident. Americans would be killed or hurt in a U-boat attack, and when that happened, the American people would respond emotionally, and they would demand war against Germany, and the U.S. would get sucked into this European conflict that most Americans believed it had no business being sucked into. Wilson, however, was a moralist. He believed in a very strict sense of right and wrong. The law of nations was black and white. What the Germans was doing with their U-boats was wrong, and therefore he was not going to forbid Americans from exercising their right to travel to Europe on whatever ship they wanted. And so Wilson left the door to tragedy open. And that tragedy struck in May of 1915 when a German U-boat sank the British passenger liner, the Lusitania, just a few hours out of its port of Liverpool. More than 1,200 people died in that sinking, including 128 Americans. The Lusitania went down very, very quickly. The bodies of victims washed ashore on the coast of England and Ireland for weeks to come in desperate efforts to identify those bodies. They hung numbers around their chest and photographed them and published them in the newspapers. And so for weeks and months, people on both sides of the Atlantic stared at the faces of men, women, children, infants, elderly people, and were reminded of the barbarity of unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans played this very badly from a public relations standpoint. They hailed the sinking of Lusitania as a great triumph. They struck a special medal for the crew of the U-20, which had sunk the ship. And by the time the Germans realized that that was not playing well in the United States, it was too late. The Germans had become the villains. The American people reacted pretty much as William Jennings Bryan had predicted. They demanded that the United States punish Germany. The problem is that President Wilson knew that he didn't want to take the United States into this war. And he was probably also aware that he was at least partially responsible for the Lusitania tragedy. So he refused to take the country to war. He came out and he said, there's such a thing as a nation being so right that it does not need to convince others by the force of arms. And of course, as he saw it, the United States was right. We had every right to let our citizens travel on whatever ship to whatever destination they wanted. The Germans were in the wrong. And the Germans would therefore have to acknowledge that. So he sent a series of diplomatic notes to the Germans, demanding ultimately that they no longer attack any passenger liners, and that if they did, it would be viewed as a, quote, deliberately unfriendly act. The Germans, by now recognizing the mistake they had made, actually were willing to give Wilson what he wanted, but they could not publicly announce it. Because can you imagine the Germans coming out and saying, okay, passenger liners are now forbidden to be attacked by U-boats. Well, you just told the Allies, if you have a vital cargo that has to cross the Atlantic Ocean, this is the ship to put it on. So the Germans issued secret orders to their submarine captains, no more attacks on passenger liners, but they didn't publicly announce it. And so Wilson has sort of drawn a line in the sand and dared the Germans to cross it. And of course, he's hoping that the Germans won't cross it. The difficulty is that not every merchant ship looks like a passenger liner. You know, the Lusitania reminds you of the Titanic, long, black, sleek hull and magnificent white superstructure and those four big funnels. And so what do you do when there's something that looks more like an ordinary merchant ship that's also carrying passengers and it's flying the British flag, and some of those passengers are Americans, and they wind up in the sights of a U-boat. Well, the U-boat captain isn't going to know what his target is, except that it's an enemy ship, and he's going to attack. And that's what happened. The Germans, just a handful of months later, sank another British ship, the Sussex, and Americans were on board and hurt. And then a few months after that, they attacked a French Channel steamer and did significant damage to it. They didn't sink it. And this is the first ship was the Arabic. This is the Sussex. And as a consequence of that, the Germans seem to have crossed Wilson's line. And Wilson says, okay, what of it? And at this juncture, the Germans realize that they're right on the precipice of the United States coming into the war. And the Germans can't let that happen. So the Germans issue what's called the Sussex Pledge, and basically they abandon submarine warfare against England. They say we'll only attack without warning enemy warships. But they tie a string to that. If they're going to abandon their submarine blockade of England, they want the United States to use its leverage to get the British to abandon their naval blockade of Germany. Wilson plays up the first part of the Sussex Pledge and downplays the second part. So he plays up to the American people, look, the Germans have abandoned unrestricted submarine warfare. That's what we wanted them to do. And notice that I got them to do it without taking us into the war. Wilson knows that there's no way the British are going to abandon their naval blockade. It's too important to them. The Royal Navy's always been England's trump card. And so really what Wilson has is a situation where the clock is ticking. The clock is ticking. The Germans will wait for a while, but they will not wait indefinitely. And what Wilson's hoping is that in the time that he has, he can act as a broker between the Allied and the Central Powers to get a peace without victory, as he puts it. To try and talk both sides into saying, look, nobody can win, and to continue the fighting is madness. So why don't we just stop? Why don't we just stop? It was very unlikely that Wilson would have ever been able to manage that. Too much blood, too much treasure had already been poured into the war by both sides for their leaders to simply turn to the populace of their countries and say, oh, well, it was a big mistake. We're not going to gain anything out of this. But it was the only hope that Wilson really had. And he might have been able to accomplish something, I suppose, if he had not been undermined by the course of events. And one of the things that's going to distract Wilson, of course, is the Civil War in Mexico, which had been going on for more than a decade, and eventually spilled over into the United States when Mexican forces under Francisco Pancho Villa attacked a town, Columbus, New Mexico, and the nearby camp of the United States Cavalry was there. The attack for Pancho Villa backfired because about half of his troops were very quickly chased down, shot, killed, captured. He himself was wounded, but in response, President Wilson is going to call up the entire National Guard, including troops of the Texas National Guard. The National Guard had only been created in 1903 by Congress, so this is its first major mobilization. And the Guard goes down to the Rio Grande border to keep something like this from happening again. And then 4/5 of the American Army, under the command of General John J. Blackjack Pershing, invade Mexico for the purposes of catching or killing Pancho Villa. And so now Wilson's got this entanglement on our southern border, which is making things a little bit awkward for him. It's a good thing that the Sussex Pledge has been made, because trying to juggle both of those things at the same time would have been very difficult. Ultimately, Pershing's punitive expedition winds up 400 miles deep inside Mexico. It never does get Pancho Villa, although it wounded him early on and removes him from the scene. The punitive expedition, as it's called, is actually a success at its primary mission, which is to secure the American border, to keep something like the raid on Columbus from ever happening again. But because Wilson had said its mission was to get Pancho Villa, it can't withdraw if it hasn't caught Pancho Villa. And months and 400 miles into Mexico, the Mexican government got tired of the presence of American troops and actually sent Mexican troops to confront them. And there were a couple of skirmishes that threatened to embroil the United States in a war with Mexico. Fortunately, that's not something the leader of Mexico or the leader of the United States wanted, so the two sides sort of backed off and agreed to stare at each other for a while. Wilson was unwilling to have the punitive expedition withdraw as a presidential election loom, because that's the other thing that's happening in 1916, isn't it? In that November, there's going to be a presidential election. Wilson, a Democrat, is going to run for a second term. And it was very unlikely he would get a second term because he had only gotten into office in 1912 because of a split in the Republican Party between the progressive Teddy Roosevelt and the conservative William Taft. The Democrats, therefore, have every reason to anticipate that a united Republican Party is going to defeat Wilson in 1916. The Republicans nominated Charles Hughes, who was a Supreme Court justice, to run, and both Hughes and Wilson were progressives. There really wasn't a lot to choose between them. Hughes needed to differentiate himself from Wilson somehow, and he did that by saying that Wilson had gone too easy on the Germans, that if Hughes had been president, he would have taken a tougher stance against the Germans and their U-boat threat. And that allowed Wilson to play Hughes as the war candidate, to say, if you vote for Wilson, you're voting to keep the United States out of World War I. If you vote for Hughes, you're voting to take the United States into World War I. And so Wilson's primary campaign slogan, he kept us out of war, which was translated in the minds of a lot of Americans to, he will keep us out of war. Despite that, it was a very close campaign. And the reality that the Republican Party was the majority party and the dominant party weighed very much against the chances of Wilson getting reelected. But to almost everyone's amazement, Wilson managed to pull out a very narrow victory. The South, the old Confederacy, which was solidly Democratic, stuck with him, and the West went Democratic as well. So Wilson won re-election, and he won a second term by a margin of only 600,000 popular votes. So in a contest that was in essence a surrogate for the question, go to war, don't go to war, we find that the American people are almost evenly divided in 1916. The irony is that having gotten reelected in November of 1916, Wilson now knows that he's got only probably a handful of months to try and broker the peace in Europe that he hopes can be achieved without victory before the Germans tire of the Sussex Pledge and resume unrestricted submarine warfare. Wilson's hopes that he can accomplish that, however, are completely undermined by the outbreak of the Russian Revolution. The Russian government had mismanaged its war effort horribly. It had stripped the civilian economy to keep its armies in the field, and although the Russian people had fought very bravely and were very dedicated to their country and to victory, their armies had performed badly. So in essence, you had caused this horrible domestic hardship without a corresponding military advantage. And the government of Tsar Nicholas was very unpopular, it was very autocratic, and that opened the door for revolution. And so the Russian Revolution breaks out in January of 1917. Ultimately, it will lead to the Bolshevik Revolution, the rise of the communists in Russia. And when the Bolsheviks get in charge, they want to concentrate on consolidating their power in Russia, which means that they're willing to make a separate peace with the Central Powers. And so the Russians drop out of the war. The Russians drop out of the war. And when the Russians give up, that means that for the first time, the Germans can concentrate most of their military force on the Western Front. They'll have a numerical superiority against England and Belgium and France for the first time, and therefore the Germans see the possibility of actually winning this conflict outright. And to that end, they determined to prep the battlefield by resuming unrestricted submarine warfare, knowing that this would probably drag the United States into the war. The Germans were willing to take that calculated risk for a couple of reasons. First, they believed that their new numerical superiority in the Western Front and new tactics that they had developed, stormtrooper tactics, would allow them to breach the Allied lines, capture Paris, and win the war. The Germans also knew that the American army was very small. If you count the regular army and the National Guard together, the United States had less than 250,000 troops. We had virtually no airplanes, no radios, no trucks, no tanks, no artillery pieces. It would take the Americans years to mobilize, the Germans believed, and even longer to get a substantial army into Europe. And by that time, the Germans were certain that they would have won the war. But being a very thorough people, the Germans weren't going to take any chances. They knew that declaring unrestricted submarine warfare would most likely bring the United States into the conflict, and a way to ensure that the Americans had no impact on the Western Front was to embroil them in a war in the Western Hemisphere. So the Germans sent an offer to Mexico, and this is the infamous Zimmermann telegram, which was actually a radio transmission intercepted and decoded by the British and then turned over to the United States. They called it a telegram to try and conceal the fact that they had intercepted and decoded a German radio message. And the Zimmermann telegram tells the Mexicans that Germany is going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, that it's going to attempt to keep the United States neutral. But in the event that that doesn't work, they're making Mexico an offer of alliance on the following terms: make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer her lost territories in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When the Zimmermann telegram landed on Wilson's desk, he finally understood that the German government was hostile to the United States. Mexico wisely wanted nothing to do with this offer, but for the American people, it was now clear that Germany was an enemy and had malicious intent toward the United States. And close on the heels of the Zimmermann telegram, of course, come the renewal of unrestricted submarine warfare, and in just a couple of weeks, at the beginning of March of 1917, German U-boats sank 5 American ships in the Atlantic. And at that point, Wilson knows he has no other choice. He goes before the Congress on April 2nd of 1917, and he asks it to declare war on Germany. And on April 6th, the United States Congress did exactly that. So now, finally, the United States is in World War I. And how ironic, Wilson, elected November of 1916 on the promise he kept us out of war, in April of 1917, just a month after he's inaugurated for a second term, takes us into what was at that point in time the bloodiest war in human history. Americans responded enthusiastically to the outbreak of war. They rushed to the colors, as they always do when the country enters a conflict. And almost 200,000 Texans will serve in the armed forces of the United States during World War I. Texas will supply the 4th highest number of troops of any other state. Only Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania will provide more troops to the American war effort than Texas. The major contribution of Texas to the war, however, was through its National Guard. The National Guard, remember, had been created in 1903. It had been mobilized for the first time in the punitive expedition crisis of 1916. But now you bring together the National Guard regiments of the states and you begin to form them into infantry divisions. And a division is sort of a mini army. It has its own infantry, it has its own artillery, it has its own communications and engineers and medical troops so that it can sustain itself in combat for a very long time. You took the National Guard units of Texas and Oklahoma and put them together into a single division that was called the 36th Infantry Division. And it was at this point that the old way of designating military units that we had used since the time of the Revolution, the 1st Texas Infantry, the 2nd Texas Infantry, the 3rd Texas Infantry, the 1st Texas Cavalry, that goes away. And the Army gives these units sort of a numerical sequence. So you get the 141st, 142nd, 143rd, and 144th Infantry regiments. that belonged to the 36th Infantry Division. And these are Oklahoma and Texas National Guard troops that are brought together initially. Sooner or later, of course, there will be draftees and enlistees who come from all the states of the Union who become part of this division. The division trains at Camp Bowie, just outside of Fort Worth, Texas, and it's going to be there for almost a year. The man in charge of training the division was a veteran of the United States Armed Forces, a graduate of West Point, Major General Edwin St. John Grebel. He was a very competent officer. He was very good at training troops, and he put these men through their paces. Some of the training wasn't very realistic for what was going on the Western Front. General Pershing, who now got command of the entire American army that was being assembled and sent to Europe, believed that the rifleman was the primary player on the battlefield. He was more important than the machine gun. And so marksmanship was emphasized, bayonet fighting was emphasized, but there was also plenty of training in trench warfare, which of course had been the dominant kind of warfare since the second half of 1914. Grebel did a very credible job in training the 36th Division, but in 1917, General Grebel was an old fella. He was born in 1859, and he wasn't able to pass the physical necessary to deploy with the division. And so when the division began to ship overseas between July and August of 1918, General Grebel didn't go with them. The 36th had a new commander, and that was Major General William R. Smith, who was younger, but also a West Point graduate, a veteran of the American Armed Forces. Smith is the one who's actually going to lead the 36th Infantry Division into combat. By the time that the 36 arrives in France at the end of August in 1918, American troops have been in France for better than a year. The first contingent of U.S. troops got to France in July of 1917. That initial contingent was really symbolic, but among the first divisions to go over were small elements of all the National Guard divisions that had been put together in the 82nd Infantry Division, which was known as the All-American Division for that reason. So one of our supply units was assigned to that force, and so the Texas Guard, in a way, gets into the fight very early on. The initial American units that get to France spend a lot of time training. When the Germans launched their massive spring offensive in March of 1918, using their new stormtrooper tactics, they actually blow through the British and French front lines in a remarkably short time, in a matter of days. And they drive all the way toward Paris by the summer of 1918, and it was at that moment that the first American divisions go into the battle. General Pershing agrees to release his troops and send them into combat to plug holes that the Germans are tearing in the British and French lines. And so at places like Belleau Wood and the Marne and Chateau-Thierry and Cantigny, those first American divisions, made up of Army and Marine troops, managed to help blunt the German drive on Paris and force the Germans back to their starting point, so that by the fall of 1918, when the 36 arrives on the battlefield, the Allies are undertaking their own final offensive to try and defeat the Germans. So the 36th Division spends a month in France undergoing training. Its artillery separated from it and sent to a special artillery school, and it's never actually going to manage to get into combat. The infantry, however, after a month of extra training, is sent to the front lines at the end of September, the beginning of October 1918, and they're attached to the reserve of the 4th French Army, which is operating on the left flank of the U.S. First Army under Pershing, which is launching the biggest, bloodiest, longest American offensive of the war into a heavily fortified German zone that is anchored on one side by the Meuse River and on the other side by the Argonne Force. So this is known as the Muse-Argonne offensive. The job of the 36th and the 2nd U.S. Infantry Division are to support the French 4th Army in advancing along the left flank of the Americans who are fighting their way through the Meuse-Argonne. The situation, of course, was chaotic. Behind the front lines, there was a tangle of vehicles and troops trying to get to the front, and wounded and injured and relieved units trying to get to the rear. There was still a lot of horse-drawn conveyance used in World War I. You can see this model 1901 escort wagon behind me. The wagons carried supplies, water, munitions, so you had millions of horses as well as millions of troops there on the front lines. So you can imagine the desperately confusing situation that the 36 waded through as it tried to get to the front. Ahead of it, the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division, made up of soldiers and Marines, had managed to take, in several days of very heavy fighting, a key German position called Mount Blanc, or White Mountain. The job of the 36 was to come in to relieve the 2nd Infantry Division and exploit that victory by attacking the German strong point around the village of Saint-Étienne. And so the major offensive action, the biggest battle of the 36 in World War I, begins on October 8th and 9th of 1918 as it launches this assault on Saint-Étienne. There were 2 days of very vicious fighting that the division went through, but ultimately it did manage to break through the German front lines and to begin to pursue the Germans back toward the Inn River. The 36 during this period is going through quite the learning curve. It's a green division going into combat for the first time and in the most difficult circumstances that you could imagine. It was, however, a division that could also innovate as well as learn. And one of the real innovations the division was responsible for in World War I was the use of Native Americans, specifically Choctaw Indians, who were members of the division from Oklahoma, as code talkers. During World War I, you had for the first time extensive use of modern communications on the battlefield. Radio was still in an infancy, so field phones were the primary method of modern communication. You could send couriers with written or handwritten messages across the battlefield. You could use carrier pigeons, but all of those things were slow and fraught with danger because the courier could be killed or wounded. He could get lost. The message could get garbled, whereas a field phone was almost instantaneous. The problem was the enemy could tap into your field phone lines and intercept your communications. And so you had to code those communications, which takes time on one end while you code, and then takes time on the other end while you decode. And at a moment when rapid communication might be vital to battlefield success or victory, the time lost on either end could be the difference between losing or winning a battle. The officers of the 36 said, well, what if we don't have to do the decoding? So they got some of the Choctaw Indians, made them communication specialists, and since the Choctaw language is not a written language and the Germans had never heard of it before, the Choctaw on one end could speak to a Choctaw on the other end, speak in their native tongue, no time wasted coding or decoding, you just have to translate on the two ends, and even when the Germans intercepted the communications, they could make heads or tails out of it. And this is a real innovation. It's something that had the war gone on even longer, probably would have spread throughout the American army. And of course, it's the harbinger of the use of Navajo code talkers in the Pacific theater of World War II by the United States Marines some 22 years later. The Americans of the 36 managed to push all the way to the Inn River. They overran a German bridgehead at Foret Farm in a textbook-style attack that proved how much the division had learned in a brief 24 days of combat. That's all the combat that the 36 would see in World War I. But in that 24 days, it had advanced a significant distance and had helped to land a real grievous wound into the side of the German army. The 36 was pulled off the line and reassigned to the U.S. First Army at the end of October of 1918, but it's not going to get back into action before the war comes to an end on November 11th with the signing of an armistice that produces a cessation of hostility pending the negotiation of a peace treaty. In that very brief period of time, 24 days, the 36th made quite a reputation for itself. 2 men of the 36 managed to earn the Medal of Honor, Corporal Sampler and Corporal Turner, both of them in incredible acts of bravery, attacking single-handedly enemy machine gun positions when their troops were pinned down, and enabling their troops to continue to advance. In addition to those 2 medals of honor, there were 30 Distinguished Service Crosses awarded to men of the division. That's the 2nd highest award for valor in the American Army. And the French awarded 120 Croix de Guerre, or Crosses of War, which is one of their highest honors, to men who wore the 36th Infantry Division insignia. All of that, of course, came at a price. Hundreds of men from the division killed, hundreds more gassed, thousands wounded, 2,601 casualties suffered in 24 days. That is almost half of all the Texans who lost their lives in World War I. You had more than 5,700 Texans who became casualties during the First World War. The 36th Division would participate in the occupation of Germany after the war was over, and then in 1919 it would be brought home back to the United States. It was after the war, by the way, that the division's famous shoulder patch, the T patch as it's called, was developed. The shoulder insignia worn by American military units today was born in World War I. The insignia of the 36th Division represented that combination of Oklahoma National Guard heritage. It was a blue arrowhead representing Oklahoma, which before it became a state was known as the Indian Territory, with a T for Texas superimposed on top of it. Interestingly, the War Department didn't approve that patch until November 11th of 1918. So the day the war ended, the T patch was approved. So it wasn't worn in combat, was worn during the occupation. Of course, it was on the sleeve of the troops when they came home, came back to Fort Worth, to Camp Bowie, to have a big victory parade in the fall of 1919, after which the division was demobilized and became an all-Texas division, and would remain an all-Texas division until it was mobilized again in November of 1940 for participation in a Second World War. We want to thank you for joining us today and helping us remember the role of the Texas National Guard in the First World War and the importance of the First World War in the history of the 20th and the 21st century. If you'd like to learn more about the Texas National Guard or World War I, we invite you to visit the Texas Military Forces Museum located at Camp Mabry off 35th Street in Mopac in downtown Austin. The museum is open to the public Tuesday through Sunday from 10 to 4, and admission is free. And we'd love to have you.